All right, so we left off with TR leaving office, Taft coming in. Obviously, TR leaves a major shadow, a looming shadow for Taft. He and Taft have become pretty close. Taft was pretty much handpicked by TR to run. TR decided not to run for another term, which would, in his mind, have been a third term, even though he was only elected to one term. So Taft comes in, keeps the trust busting alive, also institutes one of TR's plans for imperialism, known as dollar diplomacy, that we'll dig into in lesson 6. But Taft also divides the Republican Party. He removes a number of TR's cabinet members. He's going to have a pretty controversial movement in getting rid of Gifford Pinchot, the U.S. Treasury Department, the head of the U.S. Treasury Department, and replacing him with Richard Ballinger. And then there's a number of other things that are connected with Taft. Obviously, TR didn't feel that Taft was doing as good of a job as he could be. TR was one to sort of meddle, and TR returns from this safari hunt, this lion hunt, invigorated and frustrated that he's not in the White House. So Taft has to deal with that. Taft is also, he didn't really want the presidency in the first place. His dream job was to be Supreme Court Justice, which he'll be tapped after his term in office. He had really sort of, again, was grappling with infighting among the Republicans, and also the splintering created by Teddy Roosevelt as a new populist movement rises up as TR as its new candidate, and that party is going to be called the Bull Moose Party. And they're actually going to run TR as their candidate in 1914, and this is a sort of a populist party movement. Not sort of, it is, but do keep in mind that a lot of the populists by this point have been absorbed by the Democratic Party as well. So when it's all said and done, Taft has success with dollar diplomacy in Latin America, but not so much in China. He has success busting up trusts, but it was not as widely publicized as TR, and he certainly didn't have the persona, character, and the bravado that TR had in office. He was a bit more low-key than TR. So when he runs for re-election in 1912, he's going to be pretty devastated with the fact that TR as the Bull Moose candidate really turns this campaign into a mudslinging campaign and a personal attack on Taft's character and Taft as a person. And it just breaks the guy's heart. And ultimately what TR and the Bull Moose do, they divide the Republican Party vote. A lot of the more moderate and classically liberal Republicans who were TR supporters got behind the Bull Moose, and this opens up the door for the Democrats to regain control of the White House. And we hadn't had a Democrat, or they hadn't had a Democrat in since Grover Cleveland, and now they've got Woodrow Wilson coming in 1912. Wilson is going to keep the progressive spirit alive. He is going to institute what is called the New Freedom Program. It developed the Federal Reserve. It pushed forth the Children's Bureau for child protection laws. It also pushed forth the Clayton Antitrust Act, shored up the loopholes in Sherman, like outlawing price fixing, protecting unions, etc. So we'll get more into Wilson's presidency a bit later. Taft, as I said, he'll wind up on the Supreme Court after the fact. He is the only president, and may very well be the only president that will ever be in this scenario. I find it pretty difficult to imagine, it may happen, a former president in the present era and even moving forward getting nominated and confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. Why do you think that might be a little more difficult in today's era? Any ideas? Not saying they're not capable. On paper, President Obama would be more than capable of gaining a seat, because what does Obama have going for him in his background? A law degree. He was president, but he's got that going for him. But yeah, it's a pretty solid credential. Good point, Blake. But what is he also besides? He's got the law degree. He's got the credential as president. He's got a background in law that is important for a Supreme Court justice to have, called constitutional law, right? We want our Supreme Court justices to know the Constitution backward and forward. We might not. Clearly, Bill Clinton's pretty old. He has a law degree, right? He's a Yale graduate. We know George W. Bush, he doesn't have a strong background in constitutional law. I doubt President Obama would go in that direction. President Trump doesn't have a law degree. These might be very difficult obstacles for the former presidents. Plus, what do we know about our Supreme Court seat? You hold it for what? You hold it for life, right? And on top of that, you have to be confirmed by what group? You're appointed by the president. The other, Senate. The Senate is the one that confirms you. So that could be difficult for a former president. So here we have talk about muckrakers. Joseph Kepler, one of the political cartoonists from Puck magazine. This shows Taft bumbling with balls of yarn. The balls of yarn are supposed to symbolize Teddy Roosevelt's programs, and Taft's like unraveling them. And all the little puppies and kittens are Taft's young cabinet members that are unraveling them. And TR is peering through the window, furious that all of his policy is falling apart. Well, this isn't entirely true. This is definitely exaggerated. Taft did try to make his own way, right? Most presidents do. He wasn't a puppet of Roosevelt's by any means, but this is one in which Puck magazine sort of lampooned him, and you can see that the box of yarn is what? What's that building? Yeah, very good. All right, well done. All right, so let's move on and talk a little bit about the progressive era for African Americans. Obviously, we've talked about Jim Crow, laws that limited African American rights at every turn: voting, public education, basic public services, public transportation, etc. Plessy v. Ferguson upheld Jim Crow in 1896. We talked about Homer Plessy before. He is part African American. The census would have considered him mulatto in this era. That's how he would have been described. But he's basically of mixed race. And Homer Plessy sits on a all-white, quote-unquote, streetcar in New Orleans and is arrested, convicted, tried and convicted, and he winds up in court. The Justice John Ferguson rules against him, and this makes it all the way to the Supreme Court. And in a absolutely lopsided decision, they ruled in favor of Ferguson and against Homer Plessy. In fact, the dissent is written by John Marshall Harlan, and the gist of the dissent is Jim Crow laws are the very embodiment of a violation of the 14th Amendment. By no means does separate but equal protect your individual rights. Certainly, it shouldn't be protected by the 14th Amendment, one of the most sacred amendments in our Constitution, if not the most sacred amendment. What would you kind of connect to the 14th as a sacred amendment in your world? Any amendment come to mind that's important to you? First, yes, speech, press, religion, assembly, petition. Some of you may have used that yesterday, right? That's an important amendment to you. You use it, you're using it on an unprecedented level. All right? So it's important that we never lose sight of what happens here, because really we're the first generations of those who have had equality in the most basic form, whether it be attending school or even drinking at a water fountain. We can't lose sight of the fact that not very long ago, it was a colossal struggle for African Americans, women, minorities, immigrants, and other groups to exercise the most basic rights guaranteed in the United States Constitution. And I intend to address this theme throughout the remainder of the semester so we can remember this moving forward. Because we don't want to go backwards. We want to move forward, right? So let's take a look at how discrimination and segregation looked. Obviously, it's at every level, local, state, and federal. The place that it hits hardest is the ballot box. Voting rights are limited through poll taxes, literacy tests, grandfather clauses. For example, the literacy test, you had to, one man might come in and have to write his name, and the next man, if he's African American, even though his right to vote is guaranteed in the 15th Amendment, due to Jim Crow, that man might have to rewrite the Declaration of Independence by memory. If he can't vote. You might have to pay to vote. You might be sucked into the grandfather clause. The grandfather clause meant if your grandfather couldn't vote, neither could you. That limits a whole lot of people, especially those who are just coming out of the era of slavery. Or another group that impacts dramatically are immigrants coming into the country as well. Their rights are limited due to the grandfather clause as well. And it's kind of hard for us to believe that these things existed. African Americans are going to look to the courts to safeguard their rights. This is what's going to lead to the establishment of the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, in 1909, co-founded and led by W.B. Du Bois, and as we talked about earlier, one of your earliest female leaders, Ida B. Wells. Remember, Plessy becomes the major struggle. African American rights are going to be limited from 1896, before 1896, but nearly for another 100 years. It's not until the 70s and 80s that we see people truly moving forward from the reversal of Plessy, which was Brown versus the Board of Education, decided on May 17, 1954. But still, people are slow to integrate, whether it be schools, whether it be businesses, whether it be public transportation. This leads a lot of African Americans in the era to move north and to move west. The folks that moved north took part of what's called the Great Migration. They wind up in cities like Richmond, where free black communities and African American communities like Jackson Ward that existed in the pre-Civil War and the post-Civil War era, they grow into larger African American communities during this era. Or places like New York, where the African American community of Harlem is established. Cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, Detroit for job opportunities. African Americans are moving west in what is called the Exoduster movement, take advantage of the Homestead Act, the cowboy era, the mining era, the railroad, the buffalo hunting. It's a way in which not only can they get jobs, but also it's a search for more freedom and more opportunity. This also leads to a cultural movement at the turn of in the era of World War I and the post-World War I era known as the Harlem Renaissance. This is a literary, artistic movement that comes in many forms, not only through art, poetry, books, but also music. And I would venture to say that if you are a fan of anything from rock and roll to rhythm and blues to Motown to rap, R&B, if you're into any of that genre, all of that has been impacted or was the roots of those musical genre can be connected to the Harlem Renaissance. So we'll talk more about the Harlem Renaissance as we move forward, and many of the people that were involved in that, individuals like Langston Hughes, Duke Ellington. Here we have the Great Migration, north and west. But sadly, Jim Crow travels along. Companies like Ford Motor Company, they become segregated. Schools, public and private facilities in the north and in the west become segregated. And it's not just the South where we're seeing problems with lynchings, we're seeing problems with race riots. It's going on all over the place. So let's take a look at some of the progressive era leaders for what we would sort of consider the dawn of the civil rights movement. This is sort of the beginning at the turn of the century, the beginning of the NAACP. We have to sort of intertwine them into the progressive era. So we have Ida B. Wells, early leader of the NAACP, one of the first female leaders of the organization, the turn of the courts for help. We talked about the expose that she writes, a number of different columns that she writes on the problem with lynchings. This is execution without trial. Tragically, we see the rise of the second Ku Klux Klan in this at the turn of the century, and we'll address that when we get into the Roaring '20s. So I'm not sure if you picked that up when we were taking a look at that reading, but the expose is sort of like an investigative piece of journalism, and these become widely published. George Washington Carver, crusader for educational opportunities. He is much more important than just developing a number of uses for peanuts and sweet potatoes, right? He is one of the most sought after scientists and botanists and educators, not only just in America, period, but also an educator in the African American community. He goes on to become a professor at Tuskegee. Speaking of Tuskegee, one of the founders of Tuskegee, Booker T. Washington, born into slavery in Franklin County, Virginia. Are y'all familiar with where Franklin County is? In the mountains of Virginia. Probably been over that way from time to time. Yeah, it's kind of bizarre, but yeah, they are. So he's born in the mountains of Virginia, born into slavery. He gets the opportunity to take advantage of the Morrill Land Grant, attends Hampton, gets his education, and goes on to become one of the founders of Tuskegee. In a speech that will be widely published and circulated, known as the Atlanta Compromise, he is going to give a speech laying out his vision for the future of African Americans, saying, if you want to stay socially separated, that's fine. But don't limit African Americans the right to gain an education, don't limit their rights to learn a vocation, and don't limit their rights to get a job. Because if you do, it's going to further hurt society. Allowing African Americans to gain knowledge and skills is only going to provide for betterment. Sort of on the other side of the argument is W.B. Du Bois, or Du Bois. He's born free. He attends Fisk, historically black college in Nashville. He will be the first African American to graduate with a PhD from Harvard. He believes the opposite. It is absolutely necessary for all African Americans to have equal education and opportunity. Separating the races is not going to work. It will cause generations of problems. He lays this out in a book that I would recommend to everyone called The Souls of Black Folks, written at the turn of the century. Now, most students would say, from sort of a knee-jerk reaction, how could Booker T. Washington believe the way he believed? Why wouldn't everyone believe what W.B. Du Bois believes? And I say this: if you dig back into their past and start to unravel where they came from, you can connect the dots a little bit more closely. Keep in mind, Booker T. was born into slavery. He was born into social separation. It is no wonder that he came to the conclusion that he came to. Whereas W.B. Du Bois was born free. He was born with more opportunity. It is no wonder that he came to the conclusion of his argument that he came to. I find it important to highlight both of these individuals, because what you must understand that in this movement and in every movement, whether it be racial equality, women's rights, any of the progressive era agenda, and even into the modern civil rights movement, not everyone is on the same page. The movement is not monolithic, right? There's complexity. People don't all agree. It's just like when we get into the civil rights era, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X were not on the same page at the same time. By the end of his life, Malcolm X was more on the same page as Dr. Martin Luther King, but not always. Similarly, Stokely Carmichael, early in the movement, he was very much on the same page as Dr. King. By the end of the movement, he had become more militant. So I want us to keep that in mind when we're looking at any of these social and political crusades. So Du Bois ends up becoming one of the founders and the leaders of the NAACP. So here on the top left, Ida B. Wells. Top right, George Washington Carver. Bottom left, Booker T. Washington. Bottom right, W.B. Du Bois. And I want to wrap up with a political cartoon related to Jim Crow. This cartoon was published before there was ever a glider being flown in Kitty Hawk. So it says, for the sunny South, an airship with a Jim Crow trailer. So flying over the South, we have maybe the old plantation owner and the well-to-do white woman being flown on the front of the plane. But in the back is this balloon, this cargo balloon carrying a number of African Americans highly packed into the area. This is a prophetic piece of symbolism, because what the cartoonist for Puck doesn't realize is that this particular issue is going to just continue for African Americans. A lack of equality every turn of the corner, whether it be transportation or public education. And what also makes this prophetic is every mode of transportation was segregated, and African Americans received worse modes of transportation as years go on. Buses, streetcars, commercial airlines after World War II, taxi cabs, you name it. This is a very bizarre thing for us to relate to in our society, which is good, but it's also something we can't lose sight of. So I know sometimes these cartoons are difficult to digest, And it is a jagged hill, but it's one that like I've said before, I want to approach because there's a lot to learn from cartoons and literature that are 100 years old that we can connect to and are relevant in just the last 20 to 30 years. And that's the way we overcome a lot of these social and political issues. So, do you guys have any questions for me?